Hey everyone, welcome to our latest explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive, unprecedented demographic shift that's literally happening right under our noses. Look, for the last 40, maybe 50 years, the story of American migration has been super predictable, right? People pack up their lives in the freezing northern states and they head straight for the sunshine and tech hubs out on the West Coast and the Sun Belt. But as you'll see today, that decades-long script, it's just been completely torn up. We're actively witnessing what we're calling the Great Migration Flip.
35 years. Just let that sink in for a second. That is how long it's been since we've seen migration into the American Midwest hit the levels we're seeing right now. It just spiked to its highest point in nearly 3.5 decades. Seriously, this is the very first positive domestic migration figure recorded for the Midwest going all the way back to 1991. For an entire generation, the Midwest was just, associated with outbound moving trucks. But now, those trucks are literally turning right around.
In fact, one of the biggest migration flips in U.S. history is happening as we speak. And I want to be super clear here. This isn't some tiny blip. It's not a temporary pandemic hangover either. People are actively leaving the historically booming West Coast, and we're even seeing a massive slowdown in folks moving to the South. Instead, Americans are heading straight toward the Rust Belt. They're repopulating states that, honestly, a lot of people had completely written off. To understand exactly why this is happening, we've got to look at the powerful push and pull factors at play here. Which brings us to Section 1, the affordability breaking point. Let's start with the push factor. Why are people suddenly fleeing these former boomtowns? Well, it really just comes down to an absolutely unsustainable cost of living. The simple cost of putting a roof over your head in these regions has become totally impossible for the average household to maintain. To really wrap our heads around this breaking point, we need to look at a super critical metric. It's called the mortgage payment to income ratio. Basically, this calculates your local mortgage interest, property taxes, and insurance, and divides all of that by the local median income. It is the ultimate, undeniable gauge of housing affordability. It tells us exactly how much of a local worker's paycheck is instantly devoured just by owning a home. The contrast between these regions is absolutely staggering. Look at California. The average household there is spending a massive 62% of their gross income just to keep a roof over their head. In Washington state, it's 46%. It is mathematically impossible for an average family to thrive when more than half their income just vanishes into a mortgage every single month. Meanwhile, if you look at states like Ohio and Indiana, that ratio drops to a highly manageable 28 to 29%. So people are basically voting with their feet in favor of financial survival. Now you might be wondering, what about the South? For years, the Sun Belt was the ultimate affordable escape, right? Well, not anymore. Those historically affordable southern states have really lost their edge. In North Carolina and Tennessee, the mortgage-to-income ratio has actually pushed past 35%, making them almost as expensive as states like Nevada. To put that into perspective, just before the pandemic, North Carolina set at a super comfortable 25%. So the takeaway here is that this degraded affordability, these massive upfront costs, they're actively deterring new movers. The math just doesn't make sense the way it did 5 or 6 years ago. And the result of all these crushing costs? A massive West Coast exodus. Based on the 2025 data, California lost a staggering 229,000 net people. That is the biggest loss in the nation by far. But the real story here is the contagion effect. It's no longer just a California problem. Colorado, a state that reliably added 20 to 40,000 people every single year for the last 3 decades, actually dropped into negative migration, losing 12,000 people. Washington and Nevada, they've plummeted to near zero. The entire western side of the U.S. is taking a migration nosedive we literally haven't seen in 40 years.
All right, moving on to Section 2, from software to hardware. So, we know exactly why people are being pushed out of the West. But what on earth is pulling them into the Midwest? That is really the million-dollar question, isn't it? Why the Midwest? And why right now? I mean, the affordability of Ohio or Indiana isn't exactly breaking news. Those states have been relatively cheap for years, so what actually changed? Well, the reality is that cheap housing alone isn't enough. You absolutely need jobs and economic momentum to actually pull people in. And that is exactly what the Midwest is experiencing right now, thanks to some massive macroeconomic shifts.
Think of it like this. We're transitioning from the old rules to the new rules. For the last 40 years, the U.S. economy was totally dominated by information technology, software, and more recently, the whole remote work boom. All of that heavily favored the West Coast. But the next decade, it's playing by a totally new set of rules. The AI boom is actually making certain remote tech jobs redundant, which is leading to corporate tech layoffs on the coast. But at the exact same time, this new AI boom requires massive physical infrastructure. We're talking data centers, energy grids, and physical factory construction.
That right there is the new economic engine.
And let me tell you, that engine is running red hot in the Midwest. We are right in the middle of a historic manufacturing boom. U.S. factory construction started completely skyrocketing in 2022, and spending right now is still sitting at roughly 3 times the long-term historical average. 3 times. And where are all these factories going? Right in the heart of America's car manufacturing hubs, places like Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. The onshoring of jobs, geopolitical tensions, making domestic production look way more attractive, and this huge surge in data centers. They're all pulling high-paying jobs and real wealth right back into the Rust Belt.
Which brings us to Section 3, the data trifecta. Now you might be sitting there thinking, okay, this sounds like a neat theory, but where's the actual hard proof? Well, let's look at the independent evidence that proves this migration flip is an undeniable reality.
When we're analyzing a trend this massive, we definitely don't want to rely on just one source. But we have 3 completely independent data sets that perfectly align here. First up, the U.S. Census Bureau shows domestic migration straight up plunging in the West and South. Second, Realtor.com's active listing data shows housing inventory surging way higher than pre-pandemic levels in the West and South, simply because fewer people are buying there. And third, Zillow's home value data perfectly backs this up. Home values are contracting on the West Coast, while states like North Dakota, Wisconsin, and Illinois are seeing the highest home value growth in the entire country. 3 independent sources, literally all telling the exact same story.
And this brings us to a really fascinating irony. The places we've been told for a decade are the hottest markets in the country, Las Vegas, Denver, Austin, they're fading. Their inventory is way up, their inbound migration is stalling out, and their home prices are under serious pressure. Meanwhile, the so-called rusty cities of yesterday, places like Indianapolis, Pittsburgh, and Milwaukee, they're suddenly emerging as the absolute hottest real estate markets of tomorrow.
And hey, if you need even more proof of who exactly is moving, there was a bombshell report from Bank of America that tracked where wealth is shifting based on income levels using their own internal data. The result? High-income earners are disproportionately moving their wealth to the Midwest. Markets like Indianapolis, Pittsburgh, Milwaukee, Cleveland, and Cincinnati are seeing massive spikes in high-income migration over the last 12 months. Meanwhile, high-income migration to Vegas, Denver, and Austin is essentially stagnant. People with money are voting with their feet to secure affordability and capture the massive upside of this new manufacturing economy. We also really have to talk about the giants of the Sun Belt here, because even they aren't immune to this flip. In 2025, migration into Florida was down a staggering 93% from its pandemic peak. 93%! They're hitting 15-year lows. Texas just saw its lowest domestic migration number since 2005. Across the board, southern migration has dropped all the way back down to historic lows that we really haven't seen since the post-2008 financial crisis. So while the South is absolutely still adding some people, that massive booming influx that defined the last few years, it has completely hit a brick wall. All right, Section 4, your real estate future. We've looked at all the big macro data and these crazy economic shifts, but what does this actually mean for your financial future down at the micro level?
The absolutely most important takeaway from this explainer is simple. The narrative is changing. For investors, homebuyers, or honestly anyone paying attention to the economy, this requires a complete shift in your mindset. States and cities like Ohio or Illinois that were viewed pretty negatively from a real estate standpoint just a few years ago, they are perfectly positioned to be the high-growth markets of the next 10 years. Conversely, those beloved darlings of the last decade like Colorado or Nevada, they might actually struggle significantly. You simply cannot base your future financial decisions on the outdated narratives of the past 40 years.
Which leaves us with this final, really critical question you need to ask yourself right now. Are you prepared for the next decade of real estate, or are you still investing in the last one? The data is crystal clear here, everyone. The map is flipping. The economy is pivoting from software to hardware, and wealth is flowing right back into the heartland of America. I highly encourage you to go dig into the migration data for your own specific county, understand your local growth rate, and really get prepared for this massive narrative shift. Because the Great Migration Flip isn't just a prediction anymore, it's already here. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring the data.